Thanks, guys, for bringing us into that scripture. I got to say, if you were not excited about church before, how often do you get donuts mentioned in the announcements? Twice. I mean, there's a lot of good things happening in the life of our congregation. Love it. We're going to step into a moment that comes out of this scripture today, a moment that is simple, but a moment that is pretty intense. It's a moment that maybe you're familiar with as you think about the story of Peter, lingering in the shadows, just close enough to watch the suffering and the persecution that Jesus would undergo, but still far enough away to make sure that he wasn't pulled in himself, that he was in a place of safety. He sits there in the quiet, and a servant girl spots him. "You were with him," this girl asks Peter. Peter froze. I don't know what you mean," he lied right to her face. Time passes, a few moments perhaps. A second voice calls out, "You were with Jesus." Peter insists, "I am not," quite more emphatically this time. His voice is sharp. His heart begins to race. Of course, a third time, "You're one of them." This time, Peter shouts, "I do not know the man." And then, of course, we know the rooster crows off in the background, and Jesus turns. His eyes meet Peter, and Peter rushes off, heartbroken, perhaps tears, the bitterness of his own heart of the moment as he knows he's just betrayed Jesus. This pivotal moment in the life of one of Jesus' most trusted and beloved disciples. And while each of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, each one of them would tell that story, just slightly different. They might include a few other details that the other Gospels do not. All of them highlight this one key thread that runs through Peter in that moment, this absolutely crushing heartbreak, this despair that rises up in him as he realizes in that moment that he did not stand for Jesus. Friends, today as we open up John chapter 21, we arrive at the very last piece of John's gospel. If you've been with us for this Gospel of John series, we did it. 18 months we've been studying John's gospel. We're in the last part of the last chapter. We made it, friends. And it's an interesting finish of all the ways that John could conclude his gospel for us today. It's interesting that he decides to help us reflect back on one of the most painful parts of the story of the disciples, this moment of Peter betraying Jesus just before his crucifixion. Peter's denial, this utterly heartbroken moment where he realizes that his faith has failed to hold up. That in that moment, that crucifix, that moment of persecution, which was much smaller than what Jesus was about to endure, even in that moment, Peter looks in the mirror, and what he sees looking back at him is a person that did not live up to who he really wanted to be. And I think what an interesting way for John to conclude his gospel. Because if there was a more relatable story in the Gospel of John, I'm not sure I could find it. How much more relatable could it be to any of us than this moment of feeling that we are not significant enough for Jesus? I know it's relatable to me. I would trust that within this room and far beyond, this becomes one of those parallel stories to what happens in our own lives, right? As we think about that moment, or perhaps those moments where our faith has failed to hold up as well, where we have felt that heartbreaking sense of looking in the mirror and saying, like, I did not live up to who I wanted to be. How could I be in a place where I have denied Jesus, perhaps in word or perhaps in action? And what's interesting, John knows what he's doing as he includes this in chapter 21. He recognizes that this passage today is not just a rehashing of an incredibly painful story. Today's passage is actually the completion of it. It's the completion for Peter. It's the completion for us. John, and even more so than John, Jesus knew that Peter's denial was just not the end of his story. The book wasn't getting closed on what God had for him in his life. And as we look at it together, I hope you'll see that despite your greatest moments of failing, your greatest moments of unfaithfulness, Jesus doesn't view those as the end of your story either. I was reflecting back to growing up with my family, and many of you know I grew up on a farm, as many of you did, and there was this interesting thing that would happen time and time again, usually right around the supper hour, often right in the middle of this delicious dinner, and we'd be sitting around the table, and the phone would ring. And like many of you, I grew up in a time where that phone was plastered to the wall and you couldn't tell who it was on the other end. You actually had to walk up from the table and go and answer it and say hello. And that was Dad's job if the phone rang during dinner. And so he would often get up when that phone rings in the middle of the meal, and he'd get up and he'd answer it, and we'd just hear him say, "Uh-huh. Again, huh? Okay, thanks." And without even having to have him say anymore, he'd hang up that phone, and my brother and I would just sort of concede our dinner was done. We'd push away from the table. We might stuff a couple dinner rolls in our pockets because we knew what we were about to do. We were about to go get that dumb cow that had wandered out of the pasture again. And many of you are familiar with animals or maybe with cattle. That herd of cattle can spend time together, and you can have an elaborate corral system and fences everywhere you need to, but there's that one cow that will always decide, this isn't good enough for me. I like the grass on the other side of the fence. And they would find a way out. And so we knew what was happening on that phone call. Some wonderful neighbor would call us up and say, "Hey, I think I saw your cow down by Highway 21 or down in whatever place it was." And that was the end of our nice family meal. Because we knew what Dad was expecting. We weren't going to wait. In that moment, that was the time to go and rescue that dumb cow. John tells a story earlier in the gospel as well from Jesus about a lost sheep. Probably a dumb sheep. I think we can just assume that, right? What happens in that story? The 99 sheep are safe together in the pen. Jesus doesn't wait. Jesus goes after the sheep. Just like my dad, we're going after the cow. Jesus goes after that lost sheep because, as he tells us, he's the good shepherd. And so as we look at this passage today, I want to invite you and encourage you to step into the story, to allow yourself, it's hard, but to allow yourself, just for a few minutes, to be that lost sheep. Let yourself just be that dumb cow for a little while as we look at this passage tonight. And I realize we kind of jest, but it can actually be quite painful to think about the moments where you have strayed off the path. It can bring hurt to your heart. There's a sense of unworthiness and pain because often we know that those places where we did stray from the path caused pain in other people's lives. It certainly caused pain in our relationship with Jesus. But even as we allow ourselves to step into that moment this morning, I want to remind you that just like that dumb cow, just like that lost sheep, Jesus is willing to go after you. He's not going to wait until things are settled. He will go after you right in the moment. He'll push away from the table and he'll say, now is the time to bring you back. And he's going to show us in this passage today why he feels so strongly about that. I just want to remind you for a moment where we are in this chapter of John 21. Peter and the other disciples that were with him had just encountered Jesus' miraculous power. It's what we looked at last Sunday as Pastor Jeremy brought the word to us. They had just seen Jesus deliver this miracle of fish. As they'd been fishing all night on one side of the boat, Jesus asked them to throw their net on the other side, and they haul in this miraculous catch, 153 fish. And then the passage tells us they came ashore, they ate together, and then Jesus initiates this interaction. He says to Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these?" And Peter replies, "You know that I love you." A few moments pass by. And right away, Jesus asks again, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me?" Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." 3 times, Peter receives essentially the very same questions, and 3 times Peter brings the same response. And again, just kind of like with his denial, each time the question comes and each time Peter responds, the intensity builds a little bit. You can almost sense that frustration that's rising in Peter, like, come on, Jesus. Why a second? Why a third time? This question is completely unnecessary. The scripture even tells us here that Peter was hurt because of this third asking. He's somewhat frustrated. He doesn't understand how Jesus can't see what is in his own heart. You can imagine the memories of that moment of denial that might be rising up in Peter as Jesus is questioning him in this way. He thinks back to that moment and he says, "Jesus, I would do anything to go back to that moment and do it differently. I wish I could erase the past. I can't, but I am not that guy. I am here today. I'm standing with you." And you think about the moments that Peter has had with Jesus since he rose again from the dead and returned to the disciples. The scriptures primarily give us pictures of Peter with the group of disciples. The last time we have a scriptural witness to a face-to-face encounter with Jesus was back that gaze across the courtyard after Peter had denied him, and now here they are face to face, and Peter is desperately pleading that Jesus would see past that indiscretion and see his own heart. You can almost imagine the despair in his voice in that last response. But how would any of us be any different than Peter? To want so desperately to erase the past, to forget that it was there, and to let Jesus see who we really were going forward. We would all experience this as a human moment with that same sense of desperation that Peter had. But as we look at the story, we'll see that this is not very much a human moment at all, because it is a moment about Peter, yes, but just as much, perhaps even more, friends, this is a moment about Jesus. And I think sometimes we can miss the magnitude of this moment if we just treat it on its own, but coupled with the story of Peter's denial. That's what's powerful about doing this series across the whole gospel. You can't get too far away from that denial story before you enter into this moment here today. And there's something powerful about hinging those two stories together the way that John intends for us to do today. Because when you couple them together, you can actually see this moment for what it is. This is not just a moment of Jesus rubbing it in after what Peter had done. It's quite the opposite. This is Peter's moment of being reinstated by Jesus. It's the moment that he's restored, that he's brought back not only into good standing with Jesus, but into right relationship with God the Father. And of course, Jesus is 100% referencing what happened in that courtyard. Jesus hasn't forgotten it either, that moment when Peter denied his allegiance. But he isn't letting that be where the sentence stops. He's continuing to move forward, and there's this beautiful reality of this moment when Peter realizes that what he had done to create a gap in his relationship with God, Jesus had undone. That Peter's actions did actually lead to this separation from the Son of God, but Jesus' actions grabbed Peter and pulled him right back and said, no more gap. We're going to close that gap of separation once more. And it is certainly something Peter recognized is not because of anything that he had done, but because of the work of Christ. That the grace that Jesus continued to offer relied on Jesus' work, not on his own. And we know, friends, that as we follow Jesus and as we receive that call to be reinstated from him, the grace that Jesus offers Peter, the grace that Jesus offers us again and again and again, relies completely on what he has done, on his work, never on our own. There's just simply nothing we can do to earn Jesus' grace. There's nothing Peter could do, because Jesus has already done it. It fully depends on his work, not on ours. And this same truth that applies to Peter in this passage, it applies to us as well. And I want to tell you this morning, you can be reinstated in your relationship with Jesus no matter what it is you feel that has created that gap of separation. Whatever you have done to create separation in your life from God, Jesus has just done more to bring you back into that good standing, to lead to that restoration. I had a great conversation with a young woman from our church earlier this past week, and she was telling me a little bit about her story of faith and how she had been kind of in this scenario that I really resonated with, and maybe some of you do as well, but for quite a long season where it felt like God was very present and alive, but it also just felt like there were things that just kept kind of pulling her back into some old ways of living, kind of the 2 steps forward, 1 step back type of approach of following Jesus. And she just described this faithfulness that God had in her life as Jesus continued to offer her grace. And she had said, I looked in the mirror one day and I just knew, I'm just ready to be done with the past and to go forward. She said these words I really love. She said, I just really, after all Jesus has done, I just really want to dig in, she said. And I loved that. This acknowledgement that she was not a perfect person, but that Jesus' work was enough to bring her back into a place where she had a fresh start, where she could say yes, and she could really dig in. That just like Peter, she recognized that grace is a free gift, and all we have to do is reach out and accept it. And Peter experiences that in this passage. That sense of being reinstated, of Jesus looking past his sinful moment, his moment of unfaithfulness, and saying, I've done the work to get you back into relationship with me. But of course, the passage doesn't end there. That could have been a beautiful moment to tie up the gospel and draw kind of a finish line on it and say, Peter's back in that place, and that's our story as well. But Peter's word from Jesus actually means something even more, something that has to continue moving forward. And as we continue to follow the passage, we see that the word to Peter does really mean something. John's eager to close the gospel that he's written and let this truth be one of the last truths that we hold in our hands. But it's not the only truth that's present here. There's another connection he gives us that's really critical to keep in view when we look at this story, and it's a connection that comes from just the very preceding verses to the ones that we're looking at here in John 21 this morning. The verses that we looked at last Sunday as we were opening up that chapter. John 21 verse 15 starts us off with a pretty important detail. It's a simple detail, but it's a pretty striking, important one. John 21:15 says, when they had finished eating. And what it does is it reminds us that that interaction that Peter is having with Jesus, where he's being asked about whether or not he loves him, it immediately follows that miraculous fishing story. Now, I can tell you nearly every biblical scholar and commentator on the Gospel of John out there will look at this chapter and will point to a very obvious connection between fish and between sheep. It's not a connection I easily spot in my life, but in this moment, there's a real deep connection between not so much these two animals, but what these two animals represent. Because what they represent, of course, are these two occupations, fishing and shepherding. The absolutely two most important occupations for the average person living in that time, in that society that Jesus and his disciples were walking through. And of course, these aren't even just occupations. That would be a limiting description of what fishing and shepherding represent. These are lifestyles. Much more than a person's work, much more than just the way that they make income and put money on the table for their family. Fishing and shepherding represented a whole livelihood. Your social network was caught up in which of those two professions your family was involved in. Your economic status was caught up in that. Your networks of people that you were connected to, some of the access that you had to different things within the community were dictated by your role as a fisherman or your role as a shepherd and by the families that supported you in that. So we look at the first part of this chapter and we think, well, what is that fishing story all about? And if you weren't here last Sunday, you can jump back onto our website and you can see Pastor Jeremy will unpack that all. But the summary of that first part of the miraculous fishing story is that reaching and inviting new people into relationship with Jesus is part of the work of those who follow him. There are always more fish to be caught. There are more people to be brought into the kingdom. That's the message of the first part of the story as Jesus reinterprets fishing for Peter and the disciples. But now in these back verses of this chapter, he's going to reinterpret and add another layer of understanding on the shepherding work as well. Something new as he speaks to Peter and asks him this same question again and again and even a third time. You think about that setting, that moment. The fire's still there, burning in the background where they just had breakfast. The boats and the fishing nets and everything are probably still just barely pulled up on the shore. The disciples are looking at that and seeing we have a lot of work to do today. 153 fish to get ready for market and to try and turn into an actual profitable income coming out of that miraculous moment that we had. And as they're thinking about what comes next in their day and probably preparing for more work that would fall under the category of fishermen, Jesus turns to Peter following these three questions and he says, feed my sheep, feed my lambs. Well, wait a minute. Like, Jesus, this moment's all been about fishing. You're getting it kind of confused. Like, we're not the shepherds here. But Jesus says, feed my sheep. Some of you know that just a few weeks ago, we had a team from Central that headed over to Romania, where we're partnered with a ministry there, and I was a part of that team. And when we were on the grounds in Romania, various times throughout our couple of weeks there, we saw herds of flocks, I should say, of sheep. Hundreds and hundreds of sheep. And we learned, not a lot, but we learned a little bit about the role of a shepherd. And I remember in particular, there was one shepherd we were talking with, and he had this little puppy that seemed super playful. And so we were kind of playing with the dog and asking him, and somehow it came up that this was a dog in training. It was going to be one of his sheep dogs. And so we started asking questions about this, and how many dogs do you have? And he said, well, I have a variety of dogs. And he said, they start as a young puppy, and I train them up so that they can help take care of the flock. They can be there to help go grab those sheep that stray off up the hillside and bring them back. And when we're trying to get them from pen A to pen B with a few simple commands, these dogs can move those sheep for us and they can herd them around. And we're like, wow, you've got quite a few dogs who do that here, and that's pretty incredible. He said, well, these are only half my dogs. And we asked, well, where are the others? What are they doing? And he said, well, they're on duty right now as well. And you wouldn't even know that from looking around, but we kind of asked where they were, and he said, just kind of look around the hillside, and he pointed way up in this tree line. See that little white spot up there, just on the edge of the trees? Well, there's a dog there. And then over here, there was another dog, and we had to really gaze to see where they were. And there was a pile of junk off to the side. There was this old 5-gallon bucket that was just a rusty pile of garbage. Sure enough, deep in there, if you looked in there, there was a dog hidden in that as well. And he told us all those dogs are on duty too, but they're not the herding dogs. They're not the dogs trying to get the sheep from pen A to pen B. They're the dogs that are there to protect. They're the dogs that in case a wolf or a coyote or something comes into the pen overnight, those are the dogs that will spring into action. And he described this scenario of training up these dogs, and we quickly began to realize that there were watchful eyes on us everywhere we went by these little dogs that were all over the place. We know that Jesus has referred to himself as the Good Shepherd, and he is the one who is the master of the flock, but he's now in this moment with his disciples. He is about to return to the Father, and he plans to turn this shepherding work over to Peter and those disciples that he is leaving behind. And in this moment, even though he's talking directly with Peter, the other disciples are just a layer beyond that. And in this exchange, Jesus is inviting them into the fullness of his mission. The fullness of his mission, which includes gathering new people, inviting them into the kingdom of God, the fishing work, but also to nurture, to care for, to protect that same group of people in the faith, the shepherding work. Jesus is saying to Peter and the disciples around him, I need you now to be the one to draw my people together. I need you to be the ones who are on the sidelines, ready to protect, ready to jump in when the enemy attacks, to be on guard, to be waiting. Shepherding, Jesus indicates, is a necessary second part to the work of fishing. It's where we take that balance that we need between the width of the church and the depth. It's where we make movements away not only from the multiplying efforts of the kingdom, which are so important, but also adding in the maturing efforts of the kingdom. This is, Jesus says, the full work of the church. The fishing and the shepherding, the caring for the flock. If we follow Jesus, there's a call on us to care for his flock. It's just as true of us today as it was for Peter when he received this questioning from Jesus. I used to work with a young pastor. His name was Joe, and he had this way of describing the work of discipleship. And he described it like this, and I've never forgot it because I just thought it fit so well. He described the work of discipleship and the journey of following Jesus as walking with both hands out. With a hand looking back to those who are newer in the faith, perhaps younger in the faith, ready to say, I may not be perfect, but I'm going to lean my hand back and give you something to grab onto so you have someone you can walk with towards Jesus. But he said you also have to have the other hand the other way as well because we're never done growing. And there are people in our lives who can walk with us, who can grab our hand and help steer us closer to Jesus. And he said, I want to be a disciple who walks with a hand in both directions. And I've loved that picture. And I think many of you have had those people in your lives, I'm sure of it, where you have had a hand back to them or you've had a hand up to somebody else. And you think about some of those names and faces and you're so thankful for the way that they help shape and form you and carry you and protect you and herd you into the right places. And we say it all the time on a Sunday morning. We would love to step into community together. We never get tired of saying that when we're on staff or as we're in leadership in the church. And my hope, and I really do believe this is true, but I hope it only continues to be true, is that it would be impossible to attend any church, but certainly not Central, for any number of Sundays without knowing there are so many opportunities to get connected. There are so many ways to get involved. And many of you are connected and involved, and perhaps some of you are feeling like that's a next step for you. And maybe there are places where we are serving one another really well together, and I love that. But just to take that next layer of call from Jesus to say, as we're serving one another, as we're walking in faith together, do we have our hands out? Are we looking for specific ways to draw God's people towards him together in both directions? Perhaps there's a place in your life as you think about what God has for you in the life of the church coming up. And I really think it's something interesting about the spring. I think the spring is one of the very best times to sort of do that internal work with Jesus and saying, what might you have for me? The world around us often would say, well, do that on January 1st, right? Get a good New Year's resolution in place and then follow that for at least a week and then see where it goes. But I actually think sometimes in the life of God's people in the church, you get to this section of the year where it's the spring and you move into the summer, things slow down a little bit, you find some relaxation and some refreshment and enjoyment, and you think about maybe that fall mark where programmatic stuff starts to increase in your life again. And I just wonder if maybe this is the time of the year where God has the most he can say to us about our future direction. Maybe he might say to you, there's some faithful ways you've been serving for so long, and it's time to actually step away from that. It's time to release that to somebody else because I have a new person or a new group of people for you to speak into, to reach out your hands to. And as you think ahead to this fall, which I realize in the second week of June, it feels like, come on, Chris, the fall is a long, long time away. Please don't leapfrog the summer like that. We need the summer in Alberta. But maybe as you think ahead to the fall, you're thinking like, I could see that place where maybe I am a small group leader. Or maybe I am taking a step to walk alongside some of our emerging generations, our kids and our youth. I did a little math this week just to see how accurately I could speak to that as a congregation here this morning. And I'll just tell you a couple quick numbers. And this is just for our Sherwood Park congregation across our 9 o'clock and our 11 o'clock group of people that we have gathering here. 24% of our congregation would be grade 6 and below. So elementary school, and obviously there's lots of babies floating around this place. So 24%. So that means 2 out of every 10 people in this congregation would be 12 years or younger. If you then add in a layer of junior high and high school students and think about what about 18 and younger, that's another 10%. So we're looking at around 35% of our congregation would be on that early trajectory of following Jesus, right? Whether they've known Jesus since the very beginning or they found him somewhere in those first 18 years. These are the people who are saying, I've got lots of life ahead of me, and I'm trusting and hoping people will help me follow Jesus as I do that. And we've got future leaders of our church in that group. And so even in this room, we released a lot of them just a few minutes ago to go downstairs. But you think about 10 people sitting in a row, 2 to 3 of them in every row of this sanctuary are a child, a youth, somebody who needs to be groomed and matured and walked with and shepherded. And of course, some of you in this room, I realize, maybe Central's not your church. You just happen to be with us this morning. But I do bet this, that in any church that any of us are connected to, I bet there's some kids in there. Or I bet there's some young adults in there who would really be blessed by us reaching our hands out. And of course, it's the adults too. We care about each other, reaching our hands out to one another and walking with each other and encouraging those who might be new to faith no matter what age they're in, or might be someone who can give their experience of their walking with Jesus to us, and we need that as well. I'd encourage you, friends, reach your hands out. Just like Peter, Jesus has called us to care for his flock in a really intentional way, and this is a powerful moment for Peter. We know what happens to him from this moment here. And it's something that even is shared in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus gives Peter this little name as he says, you will become the rock on which I build my church. And we move out of the Gospels and we move into the book of Acts and deeper into the New Testament. And we see the ways that God uses Peter as this foundational pillar in the early movement of the Christian church. Perhaps no one of the disciples that we have record of who helps draw more people into the kingdom. He's that constant fisherman who also knows now how to shepherd. Peter is kind of, I think in some ways, he's like that net earlier in John chapter 21. He's trying to be useful. He's in the water, but he's just not really accomplishing anything, even questioning his usefulness. Could Jesus even use me? There's nothing that's happening here because of who I am. But with the Lord's help, in just one quick moment, that same net draws in more fish than could have ever been imagined. And that becomes Peter's story through the entirety of the New Testament and the early church. It leaves that moment of denial seem so far in the dust. And John offers us this story as a conclusion to this amazing gospel. But just before he closes things off, John does this thing that he is often prone to do, something which I find a little bit comical. John has this way throughout his gospel of just saying, oh, wait, don't forget, I was there too. I was a part of that story too. Even though we have this interaction with Jesus and Peter, John takes these moments at the very end of the gospel to share a little bit about himself, to make sure that nobody could quite forget that he was also an important part of that early tribe with Jesus. And I love this little tagline that he gives us at the end of this chapter. In verse 24, he says, he's talking about himself. This is the disciple who testifies to these things and wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. Kind of a funny thing. We know that what I say is true. That's sort of what he's saying to us. But John has a way of doing this, of just reminding us that he's a real guy in a real place, also walking with others, trying to learn how to best follow Jesus. And he knew, even though he tried to kind of had his little moment of saying, I'm here too, he acknowledges what God is doing in Peter's story. is so significant. What God is doing in Peter's story is going to radically transform the lives of others when they see how God took Peter from a place of denial and despair to a place of being reinstated and useful in the kingdom of God. Because John knew this. John knew that the gospel grows in strength through our testimony. John knew that sometimes the most fragile place in a person's life is the most powerful part of their story to tell because of what Jesus can do with it. Again, when we were in Romania, we would often visit a number of churches, and every time we would visit a church, we started to see it coming after a while, but usually right away, one of the pastors there would turn to us and say, hey, do you have a few people in your group who could quickly get up front in front of the congregation and share testimony? And a lot of the people in our group would kind of deer in the headlights look, but we kind of got used to it after a while. And we would, again, every time we went to join with another group of Christian brothers and sisters, 1 or 2 or 3 of our team would get up and share a short story of what God had done in their life. Often a story that involved weakness or hardship, and God showed up. And there was this funny moment on one of the last Sundays. We were in the van driving to this little church in a village. And this one woman in our group, she got quite quiet. And I thought maybe she's not feeling very well. She's usually not this quiet. And she seemed like she was upset about something. And I turned to her and said, are you doing okay? Are you feeling okay? And she said, yep, I'm doing great. And that's how she said it. I was like, I don't feel totally convinced. I said, what's going on? She said, well, I just realized something. And I said, what's that? And she said, well, I looked around the vehicle and I realized I'm the only person in this van who hasn't told their testimony in church yet. She said, I think I know what I'm going to have to do in about 35 minutes. And of course, we got there, and of course, the pastor asked us, and of course, the whole team looked at her because she hadn't done it yet. And of course, she did awesome because she just got up and she said, here's who I am, here's where I struggle, and here's what God has done. And this is why those Romanian pastors and churches wanted to continually hear the stories of this, because they were in this habit of sharing those stories as a congregation themselves, those stories of testimony of saying, here when I was weak is where Jesus was strong. And now they had a chance to grab some Canadians, some people from the other side of the world who could remind them again, not that the Canadians were great, but could remind them again that Jesus was great, that Jesus was doing that same work of taking weak people and showing his strength in their lives just as much at every corner of the globe as in that place of Romania where they were living. That they could celebrate that the Jesus that was powerfully at work in their lives was the same Jesus that was being testified about by this group of Canadians from across the globe. And so, friends, as we conclude the Gospel of John, we're actually going to take a tiny little look at it one more time next Sunday to really bring it to an end. But as we close chapter 21, I just want to invite you again. Hopefully there is a part of you that has allowed yourself to get into that place of that lost sheep, to get into that place where, even though it might have been a little bit painful, you're just letting the acceptance be there that we have not followed Jesus perfectly, that we have not always been faithful, and we're offering that to him. A few on-ramps as we hold that in our hands that allow Jesus to work in our lives. And one would just be that continual act. It can be part of your daily routine to again accept that free gift of grace. It's never a one-time offer. It never comes with a cost that's on us because Jesus has paid that cost. Jesus has done that work. Let Jesus reinstate you today. Whatever it is you need to bring and lay at his feet that you need to ask forgiveness for, the forgiveness is available, the grace is available, and he's saying, what if we start fresh today and really dig in? And he invites you to receive that gift today. Secondly, what if you were to reach your hands out, maybe in just a new way or just to another degree, and help to care for the sheep that are a part of the flock in which you travel and which you live? Again, reaching out hands in both directions. To those that you can nurture along and help mature in their walk with Jesus, and of course those that can help you do the same. And hang around the church, because the church is where a lot of those opportunities to reach your hands out take place. And then of course, tell our story. But what if you were to tell your story and just to allow the weak parts of it to be an important piece of what your story includes, to let that weak part of your story be the place where it really gives strength to the gospel of Jesus. We're going to close the message today with a final word that comes from John. It's the very last thing John includes in this chapter, in verse 25. I think it's a fun statement, but also this powerful moment where John says in verse 25, Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. And just like John says this, he sort of opens up a world of opportunity to say, Jesus wasn't done with Peter. John says, Jesus isn't done with me, and he just reminds us, Jesus isn't done with any of us either. He's continuing to write his own story across all of our lives if we would just let him. And I encourage you to let him. Would you pray with me as we invite the band back up and prepare to close our service? Jesus, we thank you that you never give up on us. You never assume that we have strayed too far. You never see the sinful or unfaithful moments in our lives as too big or too hard to undo, but that you continue to just hold out that free gift of life, that grace and that forgiveness that we so desperately need time and time again. That you would say to us, I am not here to condemn you. I am here to reinstate you into that right relationship with me, that if you would just surrender to me again, my free gift of grace is available. And I thank you for the many moments in our lives as a congregation where many of us here have experienced the outpouring of that grace on us. We choose again today to say we want to be those who follow you in that way, Lord. And we thank you that what that often leads us to is then a next step of reaching out to others. I pray that you would help us to see the places where we could reach into somebody's life and help shepherd them along the path of following you. And would you bring other shepherds into our lives to help care for us, to help protect us, to help nurture us in our faith as well. That the very best places in our interactions together would be the places where we can accept that we have not always been faithful to you, that we have not always followed you well, but where we have been weak, you have shown up as the strong, good shepherd who has brought victory into those places that we never could have on our own. We believe in you and who you are in our lives, and that's why we worship you. Thank you for your word and for bringing us again that reminder of your truth today. We want to worship you once again now as we've gathered still together, Lord, we pray. Amen.